I would kindly ask to come on stage Amandeep Gill, Project Director and CEO at the International Digital Health and Artificial Intelligence Research Collaborative. Thank you. Massimo Marelli, Head of Data Protection Office, International Committee of the Red Cross. Christopher Burns, Director of Technology and Innovation, Technology and Research Hub of the Bureau for Development, Democracy and Innovation at the United States Agency of International Development. And the panel will be moderated by Velsberg, Government Chief Data Officer from the Estonian Ministry of Economic Affairs. Please.
So first of all, thank you for everyone in participating both physically and virtually. It's my pleasure, and I guess panelists' pleasure, to be here as well. Today's discussions have been great, and they have been focusing a lot on GovStack, reusability, technology. But as during the previous panel, Mr. President Ilves mentioned, there is little discussion on data integrity, data quality, privacy. And today we would like to actually discuss on that very particular topic. When it comes to reuse of data, sharing data, then the current crisis and the previous have already shown how important usability of data is. And in Estonia, within the last year, the number of use cases whereby open data is used, how through consent-based management, citizens want to share data has increasingly become more important. However, as most of the listeners also know, that there are still issues regarding interoperability, data quality, how to assure that the different open source solutions that the governments and also non-governmental organizations develop can be used by one another. And I guess today we have a really great 4 organizations that can reflect on their experience in how we can achieve a more free global exchange of data. So we have Massimo from International Committee of Red Cross, ICRS. And it's an organization with a long history in helping people and strongly rooted in ethical value. And I know that you have a great ethical framework also in place to ensure that data is being used in a correct manner. We have also Christopher, who is from USAID, which is one of the largest donors, if I'm correct. And you similarly have ethical values strongly in the way your organization operates. And of course, we have Amandeep, who is leading a project on IDEAL, which is about IDEAR, which is about pushing global AI research in healthcare sector. And of course, myself, I'm representing Estonian government. We have a long history, 30 years, as was corrected. And at the heart of everything that we are right now pushing is data. Whether it is in terms of data science in general or artificial intelligence, there is much that we can also express. So with that short introduction, I guess it is time to go deep into how we can address those topics globally. The first question is to all participants, and I would like to start with Christopher, you. So could you give a little context on what is your organization right now working on, and what are the most important obstacles that needs to be addressed?
Sure, thanks, Roy, and good afternoon all. Thank you for the opportunity to speak at today's summit. And I suppose maybe we save the most important topic for next to last in today's conversation, because it's such a critical one, building off of all the previous discussions and keynotes and panels throughout the day. I should note that I'm speaking on behalf of our international development programming, so what happens on the ground at a country level, as opposed to our more internal data structures and management processes that are in the remit of our Chief Information Officer. As one of the largest bilateral donors, as I mentioned, USAID promotes development and humanitarian assistance in over 100 countries and across a broad range of sectors, everything from economic growth to food security, education, health, gender equality, women's empowerment, democracy and governance, et cetera. I could go on. But cutting across all of that, we really see digital development as the glue that holds a lot of these sectors together, and really something that has to be considered across all sectors and across all geographies. And at a programmatic level, a lot of our approach is really grounded in USAID's digital strategy that was released in April 2020. It has two mutually reinforcing objectives to it. One is to make sure that we are responsibly using digital technologies across all of our programming. The other piece is to make sure that we are fostering open, inclusive, and secure digital ecosystems in countries where USAID works, noting that the opposite of that would be exclusive, insecure, and closed digital ecosystems. And so we're not in this to just promote digital technologies for the sake of it. Those words, open, inclusive, and secure, are very important to what we do. But even beyond the digital strategy that my team is actively implementing across 17 different tracks, USAID is very deliberately trying to become a data-driven, if not a data-first organization. And if you think about what that takes, a lot of it is built in some regards off of the principles for digital development that Kate Wilson from DIAL mentioned in the previous panel. In fact, being data-driven is built into one of the key principles. But it also requires this huge paradigm shift. And it's almost like glacial. It's like moving an oil tanker at 360 degrees in the ocean, where you have an agency that's been around for 60 years coming up that has treated data sort of as an aside. And this paradigm shift really requires us to put data front and center in every single thing we do, and then build the processes and the systems and the programs all around that. And the paradigm shift is even more deliberate and I think eye-opening when you start recognizing the role of artificial intelligence in today's international development work. I'm sure Amandeep will build upon that, but I just wanted to give a few quick points because I think where we're going with AI, it's actually going to overtake everything we're doing in the context of international development. Certainly USAID has seen a lot of use cases over the last few years around the value and the role of artificial intelligence. And we've done that across sectors. Of course, people often point to health, but certainly in democracy and governance, in agriculture and resilience, in education, we're seeing uses of AI. Maybe it's to better determine where scarce resources go, or it's to help connect the youth with job opportunities based on their skills profile. Or we're even applying AI to smallholder farming to ensure that we can customize information that they need based on their individual needs. But for all of the good that AI can do, we know that there are inherent harms built into that. And a lot of the harms actually come from the data itself that the AI is using. So for example, if the data has biases inherently baked into that, we know that's going to feed into the algorithms that machine learning and AI produces. And so we have to actually recognize that up front to say, how do we minimize those biases and make sure that the data we are using is strong enough, secure enough, resilient enough, and has those right protections in place. But we also know that AI also has privacy issues, right? For those coming online for the first time who are recipients of development assistance and humanitarian aid, they shouldn't just forfeit their rights to data privacy because the people delivering services to them haven't figured out how to make sure that AI is ethical and responsible in the delivery of those services. So that's something that we are trying to understand as well. And then the last point around AI is that we know that there are unfortunately way too many use cases and incidents out there of AI being used by malign actors, whether it's for promoting disinformation or for driving surveillance and censorship of citizens. We have to be mindful of how AI is used in those incidences and make sure that we are optimizing the opportunities and really reducing those risks. And the last point I'll just make is, if we were to have this summit a decade ago, we as international development practitioners would just be thriving and thirsting for data. Now we're at this point where we have an abundance of data and we're slowly applying it to what we're doing, but we haven't quite figured out up front how to plan for that data use. And so I think as we talk across this panel, and as we all in this room look to how we apply data in our individual lives and in our own professional lives, planning for that data use, I think, is something that we need to be much more deliberate about having conversations around. Thanks.
Thank you, Christopher. So the same question to Massimo. So can you briefly describe what is the organization doing?
Thank you. Thanks very much. And I would like to really thank for the opportunity of being here. It's my second time at the Tallinn Digital Summit, the third time in Tallinn. And every time I really benefit enormously from the opportunity and the vibrant environment to exchange with colleagues and people at this forum. The ICRC, I think it's important to mention a little bit the organization, what it does, because it may not be an organization everybody's familiar with, but it's a neutral, impartial, independent, exclusively humanitarian organization that is active in conflict areas. So you think of a conflict today, Afghanistan, Yemen, Iraq, sorry, and we're there. And so it's an organization that has been around for over 150 years, and for over 150 years visiting people that are deprived of freedom because of their involvement in the conflict, reunited family members that are separated, providing humanitarian assistance, healthcare, and so on, is used to collecting and processing data that is highly sensitive, and is used to dealing with the vulnerability of affected populations and handling that sensitive data in environments that are often highly volatile, where trust is actually lacking from the start. So we're talking about trusted connectivity at this summit. We're talking about trust, and it's really important to understand what it takes to build the trust and what to do where the trust actually does not exist. So it's an organization that needs to to build the trust with affected communities, the people whose data has been collected, and of the parties to a conflict or the actors in situations of violence. So being able to get sufficient trust around its neutrality, impartiality, and independence to actually be present. And this drives the way in which we see our processing operations. Behind data, there are people, and people that we often see with our eyes and shake hands with. So that is probably the way in which we approach data. We mentioned the vulnerability of the context where we work. It's in the news about how in certain countries, and in one in particular, in recent times, if you were government employees with all your data in a government you trusted, in a matter of days or a month, actually you could find yourself in a completely different situation where your data could mean a death sentence potentially for you and your family. So the sensitivity around the volatility, digital identity systems, and biometrics data is really something that we have to grapple with every day. So that's where, for us, data protection really is at the center of our work. It's really about ensuring upholding the dignity of individuals, ensuring that upholding the agency for individuals towards their data, and keeping the individual at the center, which sounds simple in principle. It gets very complicated when we're talking about embracing digital transformation. What does it mean to uphold agency and dignity when we're talking about training an algorithm with the data sets of affected communities? What kind of rights do people retain over the data that is being used? And so we're grappling with these questions as we are embarking in a major process of digital transformation. We want to embrace digital transformation because we have an obligation to leverage all the tools that we can to do more with less and to do more for the affected communities. We're seeing conflict environments that are changing dramatically, or that have been changing throughout the years. I mean, to stereotype things a little bit, we no longer have a conflict setting where we have an army dressed up in blue and facing another one in red in the fields, and we know very clearly who to go to in order to negotiate access. We're seeing very fragmented environments where we don't know who to talk to in order to negotiate access. And artificial intelligence can be very helpful to help us reading the environment, to help us predicting who to approach and understanding who to approach and how needs could be developing. We see conflicts that last longer and longer. We're talking about the 10 largest operations where our organization has been involved lately have conflicts that on and off, crises that last for now an average of approximately 40 years. So there, the idea of an emergency response that tackles an immediate emergency, dropping food provisions from the sky and then the emergency is done, is definitely no longer applicable. And we're talking about contexts where we may need to administer aid over long, protracted periods, where registration of affected communities is necessary in order to expedite, facilitate, and make aid provisions more efficient for repeat distributions. Identity systems become very relevant. The use of biometric data to make this this provision of aid more efficient and effective is very relevant. So we're really seeing a situation where we want to embrace digital transformation. We're fully aware of the risks, and this is why, again, data protection is at the center for us. We have been looking at gathering and convening the humanitarian sector and data protection authorities and privacy commissioners to develop clear guidance on how to deploy in responsible manners tools like cloud-based solutions, cache programs, artificial intelligence and machine learning, biometric data, and so on. So this is why, for us, really the notion of trust that was discussed today and that is being discussed today really resonates a lot. And we incorporate it as part at the heart of digital transformation.
Thank you. And Amandeep, I know that IDEAR is really at the heart of cross-border healthcare systems, and I guess without what already has been mentioned, it's not possible to do. So can you please give us more overview of what IDEAR is all about?
Thank you. So perhaps I'll just take a concrete example to explain what IDEAR is and what it does. And that concrete example is a science-based, digitally enabled, end-to-end pandemic surveillance and response scheme. We are unfortunately still living through a global pandemic, and pandemics come in phases. There are pre-pandemic phases, where your surveillance needs to be high, but not high enough. But then you move to actual phases in which you need to devote more and more health resources to fighting a pandemic, bring on vaccines, etc. So what we are doing together, collaboratively with scientists, transdisciplinary scientists. So this is not just a problem. Data and AI is not just for computer scientists and data scientists. Social scientists, domain specialists, ethicists, others need to be in the room. So this transdisciplinary group from across the world, with a heavy participation of the Global South. Because if this doesn't work for the innovators, the emerging geographies of innovation in Asia, Africa, and Latin America, it doesn't work for the globe. So this group is helping us build the science-based architecture of this scheme. Because you can make a lot of claims about what AI can and cannot do, what data can and cannot do, but if it's not connected to science, as we see with emotional recognition AI, it's not going to be sustainable. So this group is elaborating that agenda. At the same time, because just the architecture alone is not enough. It's important. In the last panel, we saw how building blocks, stacks, what I call the architectural approach is so important. It has to be aligned with investments and infrastructure, as we saw in the morning. So alongside we building an investment case, how much would it take to first build an MVP to be deployed in the Global South in the pandemic management slice of the scheme? And then how much would the overall scheme cost, and what would be the returns for the international community on that? Alongside, because you need to bring in data from both usual, traditional sources, One Health as it's called, planetary health, human health, animal health together. You also need to bring in unusual data sources, air sensors at airports, sewage samples from across the world. And you need to use those unusual sources of data with your traditional data sources in these architectures. And people are not going to share that data unless they have trust in the infrastructure, unless they have collaborated on building that infrastructure, on building the algorithms together. So alongside, we are focused on the neutral, trusted infrastructure for bringing different kinds of data together in real time so that next time around we are better prepared. Instead of 300+ days for vaccines to be developed, we can do it within 100 days as the G7 has called for. So I'll just conclude my initial remarks by coming back to the data problem. We are looking at data in terms of 3 M's. So the first problem is simply missing data. Data on registration of births and deaths, data about disabilities, data about young people in the health system is simply not there. So you need to make that more visible. What you don't count does not matter eventually. So it is important what you're counting and how you're counting it. Second is the problem of misuse of data, which is where, Massimo, you went into that. In the morning also, we heard about all these problems around misuse, so that has to be addressed. And finally, the misuse of data. Data is there, but you're not using it. So it's sitting in either public data sets, which are not interoperable with the private sector, or private sector for proprietary reasons, commercial reasons, is not sharing it with others. The airline industry has just started working together on safety data with engines. This is a no-brainer. Likewise, for the emissions sector, catalytic converters that different automobile manufacturers use, data from that could be very valuable if it's pooled together. So these are the kind of interoperability issues around data that we hope to address through several Pathfinder initiatives, such as digital architectures and data interoperability, DADI as we call it, and other projects. And I'm proud to head a multidisciplinary international team with a large percentage of women. Unfortunately, we don't have a woman representative on the dais for this panel, but otherwise, we are working with a very, very diverse team. And we are on a path to launch by next year through a coalition of the willing. Yes, we are a follow-up, a self-organized follow-up to the UNSG's high-level panel and some of the calls that we've seen since 2017, Gary Marcus's call for a CERN for AI. But we want to build this together with a coalition of smart powers, such as Estonia, India, Singapore, Kenya, which hosts some of our hubs, Switzerland, Chile, Canada, and players from the international organization ecosystem, development agency partners, GIZ, for instance, STC, USAID, why not, and others from the private sector and philanthropy, so that using the digital transformation to support the health system's transformation, the health system's resilience that we need post-COVID, becomes a collaborative task, becomes an inclusive, innovative, and impactful endeavor. Thanks.
Thank you. And I guess all the listeners as well agree that one of the kind of major outcomes or key takeaways was privacy and building trust. So on that specific topic, I guess in humanitarian crisis, pandemic, it is more than ever important that there are assurances that people actually trust organizations, that they share their most important kind of valuable data. So on that question, both to Christopher and but first to Massimo, what has ICRC done to ensure that citizens actually provide data, trust the organization itself? How do you safeguard and ensure ethics of using data?
So thank you for the question. I think it's really one that is at the core of our thinking around new technologies as well. The thinking around trust is embedded in a lot of the operating procedures that we have developed over time. that already embed data protection principles from even before data protection formulated them as such. So being transparent and accountable for the data processing, tied to the purpose specification. In the kind of context where we work, often data sharing is very problematic because different agencies work and different organizations work with different mandates, and despite all being there for the benefit of affected communities, the different mandate basically could lead to data that has been shared being used for purposes that may not be compatible with each other. The data sharing has always been a bit of a difficult piece there. And that's where we're looking really at possibilities of increasing research and development in areas around confidential computing, trusted execution environment, multi-party processing, and federated learning. So the idea really is to find ways to build, not even to build trust, to accept that there can be no trust in some context, and yet to enable data sharing and data maximization. But basically the notion of data protection as applied to the different technologies is the heart of the work that we did in the development of the handbook on data protection in humanitarian action that I mentioned earlier. We took action to ensure that the guidance that was developed as part of the handbook wouldn't remain as just a book gathering dust on a shelf, but it would actually be applied, and really to enable people to apply this guidance in the humanitarian sector. We developed learning and education opportunities. We developed a training and certification program with the University of Maastricht on data protection in humanitarian action. Conscious of the fact that it's very difficult to apply these principles in certain technology areas because of the complexity of these technology areas, we are developing, and we have developed a few courses and carry on developing others with the Lausanne Polytechnic University, for example, and the Zurich Polytechnic University around computer science or ICT foundations for lawyers and policymakers, those people who often have to make difficult decisions about the use of technologies without necessarily having all the knowledge and the understanding about the risks and the opportunities that are involved. And the last pillar over which we've been working a lot, that I hinted to earlier, is research and development. We discussed about the sensitivity of biometric data, for example. Well, biometric data is incredibly useful, and I think we're seeing it as part of digital identity systems being rolled out in many countries, but also in the humanitarian sector, it's considered as a highly useful tool. We know also how dangerous it is if it gets in the wrong hands, and this is why we're looking at ways to enable increased use of biometric data while not holding it, basically either on token or pushing the state of the art of technology in this area to enable this use in a responsible manner.
Thank you. And Christopher, to you, what information systems do you have, just to follow up, in place to ensure responsible use of data?
Sure. There's probably two approaches, and one arguably is easier than the other. There's the top-down and the bottom-up, and maybe ideally they meet in the middle, although I'm not sure we're quite there. But just focused on the top-down for starters. If you take our current pandemic as a case in point, and if you didn't think so prior to COVID-19, what it has is it surfaced the need for data, right? Information for decision makers to provide services to end users and to citizens, and then information that citizens then need to take decisions. But what happens with all that data is sometimes this fog of information where the decision makers, governments, et cetera, aren't quite positioned to provide the services to the end user, because it's kind of just all floating around the ether. And that's not true just in health sector, it's across all sectors. And oftentimes it's the design of the actual tech platform, or it's the data sharing agreement in place that prevents this most effective use of data. So one approach we take is actually to pull back. And for those of you who heard the Director General of Smart Africa speak over the video, the structure that we use is actually rather similar to what he was proposing. He called it a digital economy framework. We call it a digital ecosystem framework, but 3 key pieces. The one is around digital infrastructure and adoption, right? Are there secure and resilient digital infrastructure in place that are inclusive and available to all? The second is around digital society rights and governance. Do you have the right internet governance models and the policy commitment in place to foster that? And then the third being on the digital economy itself. Are there well-established digital providers across institutions and a digitally enabled workforce? And I've lost half the community in this room already because I mentioned an ecosystem framework. But the reality is, if we're talking about effective collection, analytics, and dissemination of data, we actually do need to look at all of those pieces because we've learned over the years you can't ignore part of them and choose what you want to work on. It really is a broad recognition. So in the digital strategy implementation that I mentioned earlier, we came up with a methodology called a digital ecosystem country assessment. How do you identify the opportunities and the risks so that you can optimize the former and mitigate the latter, so that when we are talking about data use at a country level or at a market level, when we are talking about the individual users, we understand those opportunities and risks. And we've done a couple of them. We've done 4. We've got 10 in various stages of motion. But they allow us an entry point to actually have these conversations and then start understanding the data gaps and the data literacy that needs to be in place. So that's the framework model. The second I already mentioned are the principles for digital development. And the Digital Impact Alliance are the stewards of the principles. We were one of the original designers and one of the early endorsers. As Kate Wilson said, there are now almost 300 organizations who have endorsed 9 best practices for how we deploy digital technology across the field of international development. Many of them have been mentioned throughout today. Design with the user, be data-driven, build safety and privacy and security into what you're doing, reuse. And so they all make sense, but these principles really allow you to collectively understand what needs to be in place and then apply that for, let's say, data privacy and data protection. So the principles are a big one. And the third that I'll mention are something that we call the considerations for using data responsibly. And it's really for our implementing partners, but the broader development community to say, okay, if we are trying to figure out how we put these protections in place, we have to be responsible to who? It actually changes. Are we being responsible to the governments with whom we're working, or the implementing partners and the civil society actors on the ground, or are we actually being responsible to the end user, that citizen, that community? And Massimo, earlier you mentioned how we need to keep the individual central to all these conversations. And you and I were discussing earlier in the morning, for those who are just coming online for the first time, who have very minimal digital literacy, right? They aren't digital natives. They might not understand what it means to have data privacy in place, or what informed consent means. They might not understand how to address and mitigate cybersecurity and threats on device when they might not even know what those terms are. And so for us, when we're talking about using data responsibly, keeping that end user, that individual in mind is such a critical piece. And Doreen mentioned in her remarks about closing the digital divide in all of its forms. Secretary Raimondo this morning mentioned the same. And we really think that that is a critical piece to this. If we are going to bring folks into the digital age and build their capacity so they can maximize digital technologies for their socioeconomic needs, we have to focus on them as the unit of measurement. And that means across all of our activities, across all of our projects, across all of the sectors in which we work, to really bring that idea of data protection to bear. And it's going to be challenging, which is why I said top-down is perhaps much easier than bottom-up. But that is that ground-level piece that is such a critical component. And to be honest, across the digital development community, these conversations, the one we're having here, have only been going on for 4 or 5 years, right? Maybe only in earnest for 2 or 3. So we have a good bit of ways to go, but we actually, I think, are in a good spot because we have a lot of like-minded actors that buy into what we're saying, that buy into the need to build trust into what we're doing. And I think it's that coalition of willing that will continue to grow and allow us, when we come back for this summit in 2 years, hopefully, to really demonstrate some real strides. Thanks.
Thank you. And Amandeep, there were great principles brought out already. and you're working globally with different countries, as you mentioned, the project itself. So what are, in your opinion, one of the key principles or problems that you are right now tackling in terms of cross-collaboration, cross-border collaboration?
I think the key challenge is equitable sharing of benefits. A lot of partners in the global south, for example, one institute that we work with, they contributed a lot of genomics data to some of the modeling work around COVID-19. But when it comes to publications, they didn't have enough people writing out the papers. So they felt that other partners had got more papers out. And I could multiply these examples many-fold. So if you want to really build collaboration, then you have to clarify the incentives, the value add for everyone, and make it truly, the generosity of spirit. Today we have a large part of the global population that's just got, in their countries, only 2% of the population vaccinated. So it's not a good time to be, saying this, perhaps, but I think we need to be more generous with data and AI for development and less top-down, more collaborative. And that will get the data flowing. That will get the trust going if you are willing to be open about agenda setting, about infrastructures, about data architectures, and about sharing outcomes. Otherwise, I'm afraid there'll be still fragmentation. People will still build their own strategic autonomy. The larger players would be able to do that. The European Union, the US, China, certainly, perhaps India and Brazil, but others would suffer. So it's best to kind of be more generous and collaborative around data. In the development community, I think we still haven't completed, and I agree with Chris, this transition from ICTs for development to digital by design, maybe in a couple of years. So thinking deeply about digital, thinking deeply about data, infrastructures, and agency, like making the whole effort centered on patients, if it's healthcare or health workers, on humanitarian workers, if it's the humanitarian domain. So making it about the people who actually do this in the analog world on a day-to-day basis. If that's the vision, that's the value we can bring in, then that big problem of lack of collaboration, lack of trust in each other can be tackled.
Thank you. And I guess collaboration is something that we are all discussing, given after the panel itself. And just to reflect from the Estonian side, we've been trying to push in the human-centric data governance principle. So putting people in charge of deciding over which third parties, whether it is ICRC or some other organization, can actually access their data. And at the same time, meanwhile, trying to preserve the kind of visibility and traceability of whether some organization or stakeholder actually processes the data, then we leave a mark. So there's a full transparency on data processing. Just to kind of wrap up, Amandeep, back to you. What is your key kind of takeaway? What we should do globally first to solve the problems that we right now in terms of exchange of data? What is your recommendation? What is key takeaway? And the same question to others as well.
I think let's make it work in one area. This pandemic surveillance scheme, for example, so it's like a moonshot. If we work together and make all these principles, all these approaches to digital architectures, investments, neutral infrastructures work in one area, then we made the case. And then we can take it to other more difficult areas such as trade, where data free flow with trust still arouses some antibodies.
Thanks. Great advice. Great stuff. Massimo, the same question to you.
Thank you. I think really I would go back to the notion of agency and ensuring that the individual remains at the center and has some control. It sounds simple, but it's really complicated. The landscape of data generation and collection at the moment in some areas highly regulated and kept under control. In some areas it remains a little bit the Wild West. Despite proper attempts to really regulate it, we still have cookie policies that pop up where if you start digging, you see data sharing with 470 third entities that are not very clear on websites of reputable and well-known news agencies, for example. So how can we really believe that we can build trust if we're hiding behind cookie policies, still data flows that people will have to fight in order to prevent if they want to? The notion of really keeping the individual at the heart and ensuring that they retain agency and control is fundamental for the building of trust. But obviously, we all know that we don't really have the time to do it ourselves, to go and check all these cookie policies and to really get informed, to provide properly informed consent and so on. Technologies are becoming more and more complex. We're being challenged to keep up with them and to fully understand the risks and the benefits of using them. So the notion of accountability for the controller, whoever collects that data, for proper risk analysis and assessment, and accountability against regulators around this is very important.
Thank you. And Christopher.
Yeah, I just want to build quickly off of Amandeep about making it work in one area and this point around collaboration. About 2 years ago, our USAID mission in Kenya came to us and said, we want to be more data-driven. We want to actually walk that talk. And we want to do it to set up our next 5-year strategy. Come, help us figure that out. And we had our Geo Center that does geospatial analysis and visualization scour and comb through about 10 publicly facing data sets from the government of Kenya. And it took months and months because some of them were just like an 800-page PDFs, right? But they dumped it all into Tableau, they used some machine learning, and they were able to then return to USAID 65 maps of all of the different development statistics and trends across all 47 counties in Kenya over the past few decades, even before they had counties. And then they went one step further. They said across all the 20 different sectors that the Kenyan government is spending money on, here's a heat map of exactly what they're spending on year over year across all 20 sectors, across all 47 counties. And we then gave it back to the government itself. We went to the budget office and said, hey, here's your data. Do with it what you will. And they said, oh my gosh, we've wanted to do this for years. We absolutely will build upon this. And the USAID mission said, look, we want to take this data and go out and have conversations with all 47 counties, with private sector, with civil society, with local government to say, hey, here's the data. You tell us what we need to do, what you want in your counties, and we will build our strategy around that. To me, that's the idea of taking data and the power of it and applying it at a country level. And I think to take it one step further, I've had brief conversations with other bilateral donor partners to say, hey, how do we get away from the summits in our HQ to HQ conversations to say, let's get our field offices on the ground to leverage the data sets that we all have to do so responsibly, ethically, with the right protections in place, and really make the power of what data has to offer work at a country level. So for me, I think that's what's most important for what's next. And then lastly, I'll revert back to something I said earlier on. It really is the intentionality of it. What's the starting point that we are applying our work forward in the field of international development? In this case, if you are intentional and deliberate about using data well and using it responsibly before you even discuss the thing that you're going to be doing, I think that's going to position us well. Thanks.
Thank you. Thank you for the panelists. Just to wrap up, I guess one of the takeaways for myself is that we should really work on a concrete project, define a concrete use case. We are often discussing different ideas during panels, during different meetings, but nothing is often done, actually. We develop frameworks which are, in a sense, really great, but they don't deliver any value oftentimes. So we should take one step towards being more concrete, define a use case, whether it is in a healthcare sector, because it is really crucial right now during the pandemic, and really work on one example that we can then share across different sectors, across different governments. And if we manage to do that, I think we can already dream a lot bigger. So thank you for everyone. It was my pleasure. Thank you for the panelists.